It was a warm Saturday afternoon, and the scent of sizzling burgers and marinated ribs filled the air of a quiet neighborhood. Walter, a retired army surgeon in his late 60s, stood behind his well-used grill, carefully flipping patties while humming an old tune from his days in the service. His backyard wasn't extravagant, just a modest patch of green with a few flower beds and a sturdy wooden table he built himself. But to Walter, it was his little slice of peace. After decades of discipline, duty, and danger, he had earned this tranquility. The grill sizzled as flames licked the edges of the meat, and Walter's old dog, Max, lay lazily under the shade of a tree, his ears occasionally perking up at the sound of distant birds. A pitcher of lemonade sat on the table along with plates stacked neatly for his small gathering. Walter had invited a couple of his neighbors over for a casual barbecue, nothing fancy, just good food, light conversation, and a chance to enjoy the simple pleasures of life. As Walter reached for the bottle of barbecue sauce, a low, distant rumble broke the serene atmosphere. At first, he thought it might be thunder rolling in, but the skies were clear. The sound grew louder, vibrating through the air and rattling the glass on the table. Max let out a low growl, his old instincts kicking in. Walter straightened, his hand instinctively brushing against the brass plaque mounted on the side of his house, a small tribute to his decades of service, inscribed with his rank, achievements, and the battles he'd survived. It wasn't something he liked to flaunt, but it was a part of who he was. The rumble grew into a roar as a group of motorcycles came into view, barreling down the quiet suburban street. There were at least a dozen of them, clad in black leather and patches, their engines drowning out every other sound. Walter's brows furrowed as he watched them slow down near his property. He didn't recognize any of them, definitely not locals. They were an unruly mix of men and women, all wearing the same insignia on their jackets, one that Walter didn't recognize but knew enough to distrust. The leader, a tall man with a scruffy beard and a pair of mirrored sunglasses, brought his bike to a stop just outside Walter's fence. The others followed suit, revving their engines one last time before killing them, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. The group dismounted, their boots crunching against the gravel as they sauntered toward Walter's backyard, uninvited and unannounced. Walter's jaw tightened. He wasn't the type to look for trouble, but he also wasn't the type to back down from it. Years of military discipline kicked in as he calmly placed the barbecue sauce back on the table and stepped forward, his gaze steady and unflinching. "Can I help you folks with something?" he'd asked, his voice calm but firm, carrying the weight of someone who'd seen more than his share of conflicts. The leader grinned, but there was no warmth in it. "Nice setup you got here, old man," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "We were just passing through and thought we'd crash your little party." The others chuckled, spreading out and eyeing the yard like it was their territory now. One of them leaned against the fence, plucking a flower from Walter's garden and twirling it between his fingers. Another made a beeline for the cooler by the table, lifting the lid as if he owned the place. Walter's eyes flicked to the plaque on the wall, but he said nothing about it. He wasn't one to brag, nor did he believe in using his past to intimidate. But there was a quiet strength in the way he stood his ground, his hands at his sides, his gaze unwavering. Max let out another growl, louder this time, and the biker nearest to him took a step back, muttering something about that mean-looking mutt. "What do you want?" Walter asked again, his tone as steady as his posture. The leader chuckled, taking a few steps closer. "Relax, Gramps. We're just here to have a good time. You got food, drinks, and a nice backyard. Figured you wouldn't mind sharing." Walter's lips tightened into a thin line. His mind raced as he assessed the situation. He wasn't afraid. Not of these people, not of anything, but he knew how quickly things could escalate. Years of experience had taught him that the best weapon wasn't always brute force. Sometimes it was patience and strategy. The biker's laughter echoed through the yard, but it wasn't the laughter of friends sharing a joke. It was something darker, more menacing, and it set Walter's nerves on edge. He glanced at the neighbors' houses, wondering if anyone else had noticed the commotion. The thought of involving others, of putting them at risk, didn't sit well with him. The leader stepped even closer, his grin widening. "So what do you say, old-timer? You gonna play nice, or do we have to teach you some manners?" Walter didn't flinch. Instead, he took a slow, deliberate step forward, his eyes locking onto the leader's. "I've got plenty of manners," he said, his voice low but steady. "But I don't take kindly to uninvited guests." The air grew thick with tension, and for a moment, It felt like the entire world had gone silent, waiting to see what would happen next. The bikers exchanged glances, their bravado faltering ever so slightly under Walter's unyielding gaze. Then, just as the leader opened his mouth to respond, a sharp clang rang out from the side of the house. All eyes turned toward the sound, where the fading sunlight glinted off the old military plaque. The leader squinted, stepping closer to get a better look, and his smirk wavered as he read the words etched into the brass. "What's that?" one of the bikers muttered, pointing at the plaque. Walter didn't answer. He didn't need to. The leader's expression shifted, a flicker of doubt crossing his face as he took a step back, suddenly unsure of who he was dealing with. And for the first time, Walter allowed himself the faintest hint of a smile. The leader of the bikers stood frozen for a moment, his eyes fixed on the plaque. The rest of the group noticed his hesitation, their earlier bravado dimming slightly as they shifted uneasily. It wasn't just the words etched into the brass that unsettled him, it was the unshakable calm in Walter's demeanor, the quiet confidence that came from a man who'd faced far worse threats than a gang of unruly bikers. Walter didn't speak. He let the weight of the silence do the talking. Years in the military had taught him the value of patience, how a moment of hesitation could reveal a person's true intentions. He kept his eyes on the leader, observing every flicker of emotion that crossed his face. The leader finally broke the silence, forcing a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You think that little plaque scares me, old man," he said, but there was a crack in his voice, a subtle waver that betrayed his uncertainty. Walter didn't respond. He simply crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. Max, still lying under the tree, let out another low growl, and the leader glanced at the dog before looking back at Walter. One of the younger bikers, a wiry man with tattoos snaking up his arms, stepped forward. "Come on, Jack," he said, addressing the leader. "The guy's just a washed-up vet. Let's grab some beers and go." Jack shot him a glare. "Shut up, Tommy," he snapped. But the authority in his voice had diminished. He turned back to Walter, his hands balling into fists. "You think you're tough because you've got some fancy military title? You don't know who you're dealing with." Walter finally spoke, his voice calm but laced with steel. "And you don't know who you're dealing with. But I'll tell you this, I haven't taken kindly to threats on my property." The tension in the air was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. The bikers exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier confidence now teetering on the edge of doubt. But Walter knew better than to let his guard down. He could see it in their eyes. Some of them were looking for an excuse to back off. But others were itching for a fight, and Jack, the leader, was caught somewhere in between, his pride battling against his better judgment. Before anyone could make the next move, a voice rang out from the other side of the fence. "Everything okay here, Walter?" It was Sandra, one of Walter's neighbors, a no-nonsense woman in her 40s who had a reputation for speaking her mind. She stood on the sidewalk, holding a basket of freshly baked cookies, her sharp eyes scanning the scene. Behind her, a couple of other neighbors lingered, their curiosity piqued by the commotion. Walter turned his head slightly, his calm demeanor never wavering. "Just a little misunderstanding, Sandra," he said. "Nothing to worry about." Sandra's gaze flicked to the bikers, her expression hardening. "Looks like more than misunderstanding to me." Jack rolled his eyes, muttering something under his breath, but the presence of the neighbors seemed to sap some of the bikers' bravado. One of the older men in the group, a burly guy with a graying beard, stepped forward and placed a hand on Jack's shoulder. "Come on, Jack," he said quietly. "Let's just go. This isn't worth it." Jack hesitated, his jaw tightening. He glanced at Walter one last time, as if trying to decide whether to push his luck. But the weight of the situation, the watchful neighbors, the growling dog, and the unyielding stare of a man who'd seen more battles than he could imagine, finally got to him. With a frustrated grunt, he turned to his crew. "Let's go," he said curtly. The bikers mounted their motorcycles, their engines roaring to life once more. Jack was the last to climb onto his bike, his eyes lingering on Walter for a moment longer before he revved the engine and sped off down the street, his crew following close behind. The tension in the air slowly dissipated, replaced by a heavy silence. Sandra stepped closer, her brows furrowed with concern. "You okay, Walter?" Walter nodded, his expression unreadable. "I'm fine. Thanks for stepping in." Sandra didn't look convinced, but she didn't press the issue. If they come back, you let me know. We got your back. Walter offered a small, grateful smile. Appreciate it. As the neighbors dispersed and the sound of the motorcycles faded into the distance, Walter turned back to his grill. The coals had gone cold, and the food was ruined, but he didn't care. His mind was elsewhere, replaying the events of the past hour. He glanced at the plaque on the side of the house, his fingers brushing against the cool metal. It wasn't the first time his past had come back to haunt him, and he doubted it would be the last. But one thing was certain. He wasn't about to let anyone take away the peace he had fought so hard to earn. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Walter stood in his backyard, his silhouette framed by the fading light. The quiet returned, but this time, it felt heavier, like the calm before a storm. He didn't know when or if the bikers would return, but he knew one thing for sure. If they did, they wouldn't find the same quiet retiree they had tried to intimidate. They would find the soldier. The next few days passed uneventfully, but Walter couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that lingered after the bikers had left. He went about his usual routines, walking Max in the mornings, tending to his small garden, and sitting on the porch with his coffee. But his mind stayed alert. He'd lived too long and seen too much to believe that an encounter like that would end so easily. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Walter heard the distant rumble of engines again. His heart sank, though his face betrayed no emotion. Max stood at attention, his ears perked and a low growl rumbling in his chest. Walter set his coffee cup down and stepped off the porch, his eyes narrowing as the sound grew louder. Moments later, the same group of bikers pulled up, but this time they weren't alone. There were more of them, 20, maybe 30, and they surrounded his property like a pack of wolves. Jack was at the front, dismounting his bike with an air of defiance, his mirrored sunglasses catching the last rays of sunlight. Walter didn't wait for them to make the first move. He stepped forward, calm but firm, his voice cutting through the noise. "Back for more, are you?" Jack smirked, but it wasn't the cocky grin he'd worn last time. It was colder now, more calculating. "You embarrassed me the other day, old man," he said. "You think you can just stare us down and we'll disappear. Doesn't work like that." The other bikers began to spread out, their movements slow and deliberate. Walter glanced around, taking in the scene, his mind racing through scenarios. He wasn't afraid, but he wasn't reckless either. He knew this was different. This wasn't just a show of intimidation. They were here to make a statement. Before Walter could respond, Jack gestured toward the house. "Nice little plaque you've got there," he said mockingly. "Let's see how tough you are without it." Two of the bikers moved toward the side of the house, their intentions clear. But before they could reach the wall, Max erupted into a frenzy of barking, charging forward with a ferocity that stopped them in their tracks. The sudden noise startled everyone, and for a brief moment the bikers hesitated. It was all the time Walter needed. "Stop," he barked, his voice carrying the authority of a man who commanded troops in battle. The bikers froze, their eyes snapping to him. Walter took another step forward, his gaze fixed on Jack. "You think you're tough?" Walter said, his voice low but powerful. "You think rolling into a quiet neighborhood and harassing a retired old man makes you something special? Let me tell you something, son. I've seen men like you before, police who think they can take what they want because no one's ever stood up to them. But you made one mistake. You came to my house." Jack's smirk faltered, but he didn't back down. "Big talk, old man. Let's see if you can back it up." Before anyone could move, the distant sound of sirens filled the air. Walter's lips curled into a faint smile. "You really think I'd just sit around and wait for you to come back?" he asked. "I called the sheriff as soon as I heard your engines." Panic spread through the group like wildfire. Some of the bikers looked at Jack, waiting for his next move, but others were already climbing back onto their bikes. Jack glared at Walter, his jaw clenched tight, before finally spitting on the ground. "This isn't over," he growled. Walter didn't flinch. "Oh, it's over," he said, his voice steady. "And if you ever come back, you better be ready for a real fight." The bikers scattered as the sirens grew louder, their engines roaring as they fled into the night. Jack was the last to leave, his eyes locking with Walter's one final time before he sped off down the road. Minutes later, the sheriff's car pulled up, its lights flashing. Sheriff Carlson, an old friend of Walter's, stepped out, shaking his head. "Heard you had some trouble," he said, glancing around at the tire marks on the lawn. Walter shrugged. Nothing I couldn't handle, he said. But thanks for coming. Carlson chuckled. I figured we have it under control, but it doesn't hurt to make sure. You let me know if they come back, you hear? Walter nodded, watching as the sheriff drove off. The quiet returned, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. Walter walked over to the plaque, brushing off a smudge of dirt left by one of the bikers. It gleamed in the moonlight, a silent reminder of the life he lived and the battles he fought. As he stood there, Max came to his side, leaning against his leg. Walter scratched the dog's ears, a faint smile playing on his lips. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain: his peace was worth fighting for. And as long as he had breath in his lungs, no one was going to take it from him. With that, Walter turned and headed back into the house, closing the door behind him as the night settled in.